ever discharged to a receiving water. And that's where we see the big problem, is that theoretically sites can come in and say, well, we're just not going to do the treatment on site, we're going to do it elsewhere. And then you have a new development in place. And maybe the distinction is redevelopment projects or smart growth projects that are infill redevelopment. But the concern is that as it stands right now, the permit would allow for virtually any project to elect to go off-site or pay in lieu fees or perform compliance under a watershed-based plan and potentially not put any controls in place at the new development or the redevelopment site. So at a minimum, I would say that that should be better constrained and clarified, but it would be best to just say that all development under every circumstance needs to meet these controls, at least conventional treatment controls. And in part, all of these sites, whatever the site is, if it's putting in place infrastructure on the site, is already going to have to put in place piping to deal with stormwater, to connect with stormwater sewers and so forth. So they're going to have a lot of the infrastructure in place. It's not that much to require the additional BMPs.
Yeah.
I want to ask staff to.
Well, and also, I just, in this dialogue, I would point out on E12L, that what I think is staff's intent to create a safety net on the concern you're expressing about the loophole. The second paragraph of new language states, the Regional Water Board may approve alternative post-construction measures for multiple benefit projects as described above after a public process if it finds that the alternative measures are consistent with the MEP standard. And so while I hear your constructive proposal here to constrain on a quantitative basis, I believe this type of scenario that you're describing by virtue of this language is required to be given a public hearing, and the demonstration that the maximum extent practicable with that project proposal, sort of that bundle, that has to be shown and is appealable to the state board if it isn't adequately shown. And where I'm going with this is I'm sensitive at this time and at this level to really doing our level best to providing the strongest possible incentive for regional projects. I'm concerned that this could be viewed as more, that a belt and suspenders approach to try, get the regional projects, but constrain site specific. So I'm trying to explore flexibility, but have the safety net that you point out correctly is needed.
I think that certainly that assists in this process is requiring the public process and MEP determination, but part of the concern I'm raising isn't necessarily you would demonstrate at that specific time that the water quality benefit might be equivalent, but this is over time a concern where, again, where you're dealing with potentially new development projects that are going to last long beyond the sites that are retrofitted or revamped might have been, that we will never get to the point that we are cleaning up a watershed if we allow for new buildings to come in and last for the next century with no controls on them. And so that's where this backstop comes in. I also would raise that I know that EPA, and I'm not sure if anyone's here from them today, but EPA at other meetings and hearings with the regional boards has voiced the concern that the Clean Water Act doesn't necessarily allow for new development to be constructed with no controls on it, and that's where the concern is, including in an off-site context, not just where there's absolutely no control placed, but including in an off-site context, there is a concern over new development being built without any controls.
Well, yes, and I think it doesn't pass the LAF test practically. I mean, on MEP, a new development with no controls doesn't pass the LAF test on MEP. So,
and so with that, I would think that to your concern about smart growth or infill projects, it's possible that we just need to constrain the way it's written now or provide an exemption for those types of projects. But as it stands now, there is a broad exemption for all projects that would fall in this category, and that's where our concern is.
Yeah, it's another way to think about it, because there's also the issue of incentive. I can envision a situation, and maybe the way to do it is not just to say that overall it meets MEP, but either to use a multiplier or do something. Mm-hmm. But I can easily envision there being let's pick a 1 or a 2 acre project where retention on site doesn't have a lot of value, and where the money put into a regional project can have way more benefit to that particular community because you're going to get a park or you're going to get Taylor Yards is going to happen or something's going to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise in a constrained economic way. I want space for communities that are thinking smarter about how to do these projects to be able to get the resources in where you might get a bigger benefit than putting it on each project. But I understand what you're saying. One way is to say you've got to meet this minimum level, but if everyone's meeting that level, where's the incentive to do the regional project?
Well, because meeting the minimum level is not itself a choice under the permit. Projects are required to retain the 85th percentile storm, or where that's not feasible, biofilter it.
Okay.
This is a last resort treatment using conventional controls that we have shown are not as effective over the past 20 years at reducing water quality problems, things like sand filters, vault systems, engineered controls rather than retention, more green infrastructure-based controls. And in this case, this is the sort of the last resort option, so at least a new development project that may have to go off-site will have some sort of control on it to reduce pollution runoff from that site. They are certainly effective at some pollutants under some circumstances and reduce a lesser percentage of the pollutant loading than would retention. But we're basically saying that, okay, you can go off-site, this is your sort of your choice here, but you have to at least reduce some of the pollution coming off your own site. If nothing else, to get rid of first flush problems and other concerns. But sites that have absolutely no controls on runoff off them that will ultimately discharge to receiving water are a strong concern, not just legally, but from a practical sense, that we are creating new sources of pollution that are unconstrained.
When you're covering permeable surface in the first instance.
Right.
Any comments?
I don't know if this helps the discussion at all, but I think one of the things that I think really complicates this whole issue is that, we're looking at a hydrologic proxy for water quality. I mean, we're talking about retaining the 85th percentile storm. The assumption is that if we do that, we're going to get water quality benefits. I think, in my head, we start accomplishing some of the things that, Felicia, you're interested in, looking at watershed-wide solutions by actually holding people to some kind of load estimation, or saying that new offsite project has to demonstrate that the loads coming from that project are less than or equal to what would come off the conventional development. And that opens up a whole new suite of different types of measures you could get at that issue. And that's not unprecedented. I mean, I look at the NRC recommendations, that stormwater report in 2008, suggesting that be really one of the baseline things an MS4 permittee does, is identify what the loads are coming off the watersheds, what the flows are, and sort of use that to map out where you're going to get most bang for the buck for your project. So I think that might be one way getting towards what Noah's talking about, is having, it gets back, and you guys are sick of me talking about this, but there's the whole, what currency or what are you judging these projects on? Because I don't think we have a framework yet for multiple criteria decision analysis, looking at, okay, can we give on water quality, but we get a park and we get all these other benefits. We don't have that framework yet. I desperately think we need that, because that's going to integrate a lot of NPDS stuff. It's going to integrate 401 and all the different programs we do. But I'm thinking, sort of looking at loads coming off a project might be a more appropriate way of looking at this. I mean, that's just a suggestion. Instead of just having us just look at this hydrologic proxy, I'm really concerned, Steve, with, the disincentive. I think the watershed, it just looks like, everything we're dealing with water in California is really, the IRWIMP process. We're looking at habitat conservation plans. I mean, these are regional type exercises where we're looking for where does it make the sense to invest most of our resources, and I think we need to get there, and I'm really concerned. I don't want to create disincentive. I think, but by opening it up and saying, well, you can look at the load reductions as a result of these regional projects, maybe that's a way to judge equivalency somehow, but that's kind of our thoughts, I think.
Yeah, no, I want to support this concept, and what we're trying to get at is not have, some kind of a excessive localized load through development, which is what Noah brings up, but the importance of the currency development that you bring up, Eric. And I like it. I liken it to playing offense and defense. Defense is our traditional approach of source control and conventional type treatment or green infrastructure in the watershed. Offense is getting out there and restoring watershed function, because we know we get pollutant management through that action too, and our regulatory program is struggling to grow into that area. I want to encourage communities in the state to play offense by doing stream restoration, and functional restoration within development footprints and watersheds. So keeping that in mind, keeping our eye on the game, right? You know, we need to be careful not to create disincentives where we're putting too much resources into defense and not enough into offense.
And one more comment again, at the risk of exasperating the board, and then I'm happy to move on. But just again, the concern becomes the length of time that development without controls on it are allowed to persist in the built environment. That even if you achieve a slightly better water quality benefit from a regional project somewhere, it will be addressing the existing built environment, which over time is going to turn over and be required to meet these controls anyway. If each time we allow a new development to come in and be placed in without controls on it and say, well, we're going to retrofit some of the existing built environment, we are going to extend the period by which we have newer developments that have no controls on them and are discharging pollution to receiving waters. And that's why some sort of minimum baseline control should be placed even on new development, even where they're participating in a regional project or an off-site mitigation or a watershed plan. So that's the real concern, is making sure that new development does not continue this problem indefinitely.
It's a trade-off, isn't it?
One that we think the Clean Water Act requires action on, so.
Right.
Anyway, moving on, and thank you, appreciate your patience with this issue. The final point is the hydromodification plans. I think Eric did a very good job of explaining why it's back in the permit and the need for it. We appreciate staff's discussion. We agree that with removing the sort of the Central Coast model, some sort of baseline hydromodification plan is required. While retention of the 85th percentile storm, we're dealing with very small storm sizes on site, can be considered a baseline hydromodification control. It will not get at the erosion problems and flooding caused by larger storm sizes, and we're very glad to see this back in the permit. One final point, because it was raised during discussion earlier, I do want to say that with respect to the receiving water limitations, we look forward to Board Council's discussion of this and the hearing process with regard to the Los Angeles permit. I know a lot of the different petitions address this. With regard to the board's process for holding stakeholder meetings and workshops on this, we want to reiterate our concern with this process. This was raised effectively by dischargers who were seeking to remove a regulation that requires them to meet standards in the permit that regulates them. And we feel that a large concern with the fact that the board took this process up, asking the question as, you know, not necessarily is this even warranted, but how do we relieve the burden on them? We think that the controls in place which require compliance with water quality standards, and which several California courts and federal courts have upheld, are absolutely appropriate. They are in line with what the Clean Water Act requires, and that we are absolutely open to the idea of discussing ways to make the iterative process more robust or less vague, as some have pointed to. But we don't think that the framework of should we be removing or drastically altering the receiving water limitations themselves is the appropriate framework for this discussion. With that, we do look forward to discussing the issue in the hearing process, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Noah. Ms. Fashing, now that you've had your opening act, would you like to come up?
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Hoppen and members of the board. I wanted to reiterate, just say congratulations and good luck, Chair Hoppen, in your retirement. You made me want to go out and get a pickup truck, a dog, and a pair of Wranglers.
And cut people off in parking lots.
Yeah. I appreciate this opportunity to comment on the third draft and the final fourth draft of the Phase 2 permit. Also wanted to reiterate, I really appreciate the state board staff, permit writers, professional and collaborative efforts. It's been great working with them, great bunch of people. My name is Terry Fashing. I'm the program manager for the countywide Marin County Stormwater Pollution Prevention Program. My comments today are made on behalf of Marin's 12 local government member agencies. Through our stormwater program and numerous other programs, the County of Marin and Marin's municipalities share a strong commitment to protecting water quality and Marin's creeks and watersheds. Under the current Phase 2 permit, Marin's municipalities implement effective stormwater pollution prevention performance standards and fund our countywide program to promote consistency throughout Marin and to perform effective public outreach, education, and training. Collectively, we achieve cost-effective improvements to water quality in Marin's creeks, the bay, and the ocean. Although we appreciate the positive changes that were made to the third and fourth drafts of the permit, we continue to be concerned by the implementation costs and the excessive tracking and reporting requirements. The draft permit cannot be implemented by Marin's municipalities and the County of Marin with existing resources. As proposed, implementation will require additional staff, both full-time and consultants, training, reporting, in addition to office monitoring, other equipment and resources. This will further strain municipal general fund budgets with no guaranteed state funding and our grant programs to support permit implementation. And we remain concerned that the increased cost of compliance is not totally supported by clear evidence that the new requirements will appreciably improve water quality over what we do now in Marin. However, whether or not the draft permit is adopted today, local governments need legislation that would provide us with more flexibility and options to fund our stormwater programs. We urge your board to support legislation that would amend the California Constitution to exempt fees and charges for flood control, stormwater, and urban runoff management from Proposition 218. Therefore, in order to reduce the implementation costs of the current permit, we urge your board to direct staff to make additional revisions based on all the comments we submitted in writing in our December 17, 2012 comment letter and based on comments provided today on the fourth draft permit. For example, we request the following changes to specific permit sections. Wanted to reiterate Casca's comments on section E7. This section requires municipalities to effectively educate school-aged children and use experiential and place-based learning integrated in school curricula and school facility management. And I will say that our program has been implementing this type of public outreach for years. We actually do fund place-based learning and experiential education for school-age children in Marin. We do believe in that. However, we don't feel that municipalities have the authority to require specific curricula, and we do not have any jurisdiction on public school property. So we do support the suggested changes by Casca for this section. Also, we would like to reiterate our concern about the E12 post-construction stormwater management requirements. Over the last few years, state and regional boards expanded land development requirements in each stormwater permit reissuance without enough analysis of the impact and effectiveness of the prior development requirements. Particularly with respect to hydro modification management, there's no consensus within the state on what the requirements should be for land development. Therefore, we also support Casca's recommendation to wait until there's more consensus until the next permit term to add hydro modification management requirements to the permit and instead rely on the interim hydro modification management measures required in this permit. Also, we think that the O&M requirements should be scaled based on the amount of impervious surface added or replaced. And we'd also like an additional year to prepare to implement the requirements for regulated projects. Finally, we wish that you would strike the new language in the fourth draft of the permit that requires demonstration of technical infeasibility before being allowed to use bioretention facilities. I think that there are studies coming out. There's a study happening in Contra Costa right now that's showing that bioretention facilities, even though they have the perforated pipe under drain, they do allow quite a lot of deep infiltration. And so we feel that, especially in this permit term, we're ramping up requirements enough. We'd like to just be allowed to use bioretention facilities. We feel they're very effective, and we've been using them in Marin now as we implement our attachment 4 requirements. So, and speaking of attachment 4, We'd like you to recognize that the current permit does contain post-construction stormwater requirements for all permittees, not just those subject to attachment 4. Therefore, we recommend that you strike new language regarding the applicability of the construction general permits post-construction requirements on page 44 of the 4th draft of the fact sheet. Non-attachment 4 communities should be allowed to implement current post-construction requirements until the new E12 requirements go into effect. This would prevent confusion and having to implement multiple requirements during the permit term. So moving on to a new section, section E9A, illicit discharge detection elimination. We'd like you to limit dry weather outfall monitoring requirements to outfalls that are 18 inches and greater, and only require permittees to sample for unknown flows. Permittees should not be required to sample flows from known, perennial, or intermittent streams that are flowing through outfalls. Section E10, construction site stormwater runoff control. We appreciate the changes to this section that were included in the final 4th draft of the permit. Please further clarify that the requirements for projects that disturb less than 1 acre of soil only pertain to projects where the local grading ordinance threshold is triggered, whether associated with a grading or a building permit. Finally, under section E6B, program management, this section requires the permittee to certify. Actually, you wrote this in the change sheet. You've already corrected it, so I'm going to strike that from my comments. I realize I saw that. So without a reduction in prescriptive requirements, this final draft permit continues to represent a significant unfunded cost burden to Marin cities, towns, and the county. We thank you for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to provide these comments today.
Thank you, Terry. Melissa?
Good morning. I am here today representing the cities of Tracy and Turlock and the Port of Stockton and the County of San Joaquin, which is one of the unfortunate municipalities that is currently battling under a citizen suit over their MS4 permit. I'm here because I think it's imperative that these small communities that are affected by this large draft permit raise at least 3 important issues. The most important issue, and I've talked to you about it several times, is the receiving water limitations section. And we ask that you not defer this to the LA MS4 permit appeals for some of the reasons that Mr. Loffer said, that it will put it under the cloak of ex parte and we can't talk to you about it. And I think that this is a big issue that we would like to have conversations. So one option would be to have a long effective date for this permit, so it's not effective until you resolve the receiving water limitations language. With the Caltrans permit, you gave them, I think it was more than a 6-month effective date. And so that is one alternative, but we think the better alternative is to change the fact sheet language and have it reflect what was in the 2001 Francine Diamond letter, which went out right after the LA MS4 permit. And the question that was answered in that letter was, does the permit language put cities in violation of receiving water limitations immediately and open them to third-party lawsuits? And the answer was, a violation would only occur when a municipality fails to engage in good faith effort to implement the iterative process. So as long as the permittee is engaged in a good faith effort, the specific language of the permit provides that the permittee is in compliance. Even if water quality does not improve as a result of the implementation efforts, there is no violation of the permit's receiving water limitations provision as long as a good faith effort is underway to participate in the iterative process. And it went on later to say that the iterative process was intended to gain progress over time. And that's always been the underlying part of the receiving water limitations, that it's essentially kind of a compliance schedule or a demonstration that you're getting reasonable further progress over time. And that was always the history. I've given you, 12-page letters on the entire history of the receiving water limitations language, and that it was supposed to be the linchpin of this program, was continuing to ratchet up your BMPs, because sometimes you don't know whether they're going to work or not, and if they don't work, you shouldn't get penalized for that, for trying something, but you should try something else. if the board truly wants that stormwater must meet water quality standards, then this could be a one-page permit that just says that. It says meet water quality standards, and let cities figure out how to do that. Also, so you could remove the other 120 plus pages of prescriptive programs that are time-consuming, costly, and may not result in any water quality changes. So that would be another option, to just say meet standards and provide a time frame for people to do it if they have to put in treatment, if they have to do LID or whatever they want to do. The second issue is this 120 plus page permit violates Water Code 13360A, which forbids the state board from specifying a manner of compliance. This permit has numerous examples of specific dictates where the manner of compliance is set, all of which are objectionable and contrary to law. For example, some of the things that you were talking about earlier, where the municipalities have to take specific actions to control incidental runoff, or they have to require specific messages to specific audiences about public education and outreach. It also requires the adoption of a specific ordinance related to construction site. And this issue has not been addressed in the response to comments, and I believe must be addressed prior to adoption. And the final issue is that this permit is implementing larger policy directions that have never been reviewed under CEQA, such as hydro modification. For example, the retention of a certain size storm like the 85th percentile will take land out of use for other purposes, may adversely affect groundwater, or impact endangered species, or the biology of local creeks and rivers that would otherwise receive that flow naturally. Policy making by permit to avoid CEQA analysis should be discouraged. The board should instead promulgate a stormwater control policy through a full-blown CEQA analysis and then implement that policy in stormwater permits. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Steve Wagner?
I'm sorry, before Steve comes up, could I ask Michael or Mel to address the recommendation of including some of the Fran Diamond memo language?
You know, I would not recommend adding that language. I mean, that the specific receiving water limitations issue, I mean, first of all, staff continues to recommend that it's better to break it out and deal with it in a separate process, in part because it's noise in the system as we're trying to focus on some of the significant issues in this permit. And it's something that I won't go into all the reasons we've discussed before. The second issue has to do with the fact that, you know, I'm not sure that Ms. Diamond's letter accurately reflects exactly how that has been interpreted and implemented over the course of the permit. This was actually a subject within the litigation challenging the 2001 LAMS4 permit, and as was both articulated by the regional board at that time in court and was ultimately upheld by the trial court in that case, is that may be an accurate reflection of how the regional board will exercise its enforcement discretion. That doesn't change the fact that the receiving water limitations language in its extant form is an enforceable permit requirement in and of itself, and that's been consistent with the board's position throughout that litigation. So I would not recommend making that change. But more importantly, you know, we recognize that this is an issue that continues to cause frustration and confusion, and we think that there's an appropriate process that the board is setting up to deal with that separately.
Thank you.
Oh, could you address the last point that Melissa made about
Okay, so she had two additional
requiring
comments.
specific actions?
Okay, so essentially there is a provision of the Water Code that generally prevents the boards from specifying the manner of compliance. This issue has been raised previously, and the board has consistently taken the position that to the extent that we are implementing the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit program through Chapter 5.5 of Port of Cologne, and that's exactly what this permit does. It trumps the requirement of the general requirement of the Water Code that we not specify the manner of compliance. And this is particularly true in the stormwater permitting programs where EPA has articulated that we will require the permittees to develop programs, and then ultimately that the permitting authority, whether it's state or federal, maintains and retains the ultimate responsibility to determine whether or not those programs reflect the maximum extent practicable requirements of the Clean Water Act. And so the expectation is that we will be dictating how municipal permittees will implement the MEP standard.
Ms. Thorne also made a comment regarding ex parte. I know at the last board meeting, you did an informational item on the changes from recent law enactment and the now ex parte exception that is in place. I appreciate that the LA permits that are being petitioned to us are specific and would not fall under that exception. However, the larger issue of receiving water limits as applied to the larger general permits that this board is considering, would that fall under the ex parte exception?
Yes and no, and you love it when
I
you
love
give
those answers, yes.
But the reality is, because the ex parte prohibition extends to any issue in a proceeding, what we have articulated in the past, and it's embodied in both my 1996 question and answer document, as well as prior memoranda from Craig Wilson when he was chief counsel, and then it's also in the most current version, the December 28, 2012 question and answer document on ex parte communications, is that if the board essentially, as part of an ongoing proceeding, breaks off an identifiable issue, essentially, if you will, stops the pending adjudicative proceeding so that it can conduct a workshop or other public process, that during the time that that other process is going forward, the ex parte prohibition doesn't apply. So the fact that you have a pending general order before you today, for example, on the small MS4 permit, that would be subject to, and in fact there were disclosures that are posted on the board's website, the 965 disclosure process. But that doesn't permit or allow parties to begin discussing issues that are ex parte issues in another pending adjudicative proceeding.
But I would expect that pretty soon the industrial general stormwater permit, or at least another revised version, will hit the streets, and that would also have some receiving water limits issue, no?
Well, from our view, the existing receiving water limitations discussion is focused only on the municipal permits, because since the prior industrial stormwater permit was issued, the Ninth Circuit has issued an opinion that we abide by, and it's actually reflected in our receiving water limitations language and our subsequent discussions of it, that non-municipal stormwater permits, so the industrial permits, must strictly comply with water quality standards in pursuant to 301B1C of the Clean Water Act. So the larger issues of implementation of receiving water limitations really only applies to the municipal permits, so Caltrans Phase 1 and the Phase 2 permits before you today.
So I guess this is my request, and my colleagues may disagree, but as you are putting together options for the board for the receiving water limit issue that you'll be bringing back to us, I, for one, would strongly encourage you to consider option that would not prohibit our discussion of the issues with various stakeholders.
That's certainly my intent. I recognize this is something that I think benefits from a more open discussion.
Mr. Wagner.
Thank you, Chair Hoppen, members of the board. Steve Wagner with the City of Goleta. I do not envy your job. They say the devil is in the details, and there's a lot of details in this before you. But I'll be brief. I'm actually here to speak in favor of the revisions to this current draft related to what was Appendix J, the Central Coast post-construction requirements, and their removal. As you know, the City of Goleta was one of a few agencies that had petitioned the Central Coast region because of these post-construction requirements, and that brought us up here because it was incorporated into your prior draft of the permit. With the removal of these conditions and the direction to the Central Coast staff to reconsider through a public process before readoption, I think it gives us an avenue forward, and we are hopeful that we're able to work closely. We look forward to working closely with our regional board staff to develop criteria that's reasonable, you know, that's scientifically justified and supported, that's both technically and economically feasible. We're not there yet, but we hope to get there before the decision is made, so we don't have to come back up here again and talk to you more about those requirements. In regards to our petition, we do understand that upon a little further review, the adoption of this as put forth would likely result in the dismissal of our petition. But again, with the ability to petition a further decision, I can say, I think without my attorney hitting me, I think we're fine with that. So again, I really do appreciate you listen to the comments and those concerns raised by the Central Coast, and you've given us a path forward, and hopefully we can come back together in the region and working with the board and getting there.
Steve, you have to be a little careful deferring to attorneys because you may not be able to say what you really intend to say.
Can I strike that? The part when she was going to hit me if I. In regards to the annual progress report and the comments made earlier, I do agree. I think a formal process would be beneficial to you if you're looking at using a watershed-based approach and implementing it statewide. It would be very beneficial to have a formal progress report on how it's going if we're implementing this in the Central Coast, not just at a staff level, but from the regulated view, the people that are actually implementing these things on the ground, to get a firsthand view or have testimony on how it's actually working. So I do support that. I think some type of formal public review process at the regional board that we can comment on the progress and things that are working and things are not, that then you could have, would be beneficial. With that, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tinger.
Good morning. My name is John Tinger with US EPA. I'm staff at the NPDES Permits Office. EPA supports the permit as proposed. We believe that the requirements of the permit are justified based on known water quality, stormwater impacts, and also that the permit has made its best efforts towards addressing the multiple stakeholder comments and concerns expressed throughout the past few years. With regard to the requirements for the watershed-based approach that Noah was mentioning, it is true that EPA generally supports on-site LID stormwater controls as the best possible alternative for post-construction controls. However, we do recognize that there's potentially a lot of benefits in a regional approach, either through implementation of regional wetlands or even groundwater recharge areas, which may be both more cost-effective as well as more environmentally beneficial than on-site LID controls. So we think that the language as drafted does have a sufficient high level, sufficient high bar, where you have to go through a public process for that, and it requires actual adoption or approval by the board. So we think that establishes, while it establishes an off-ramp, that permit has that high enough bar to prevent abuse of that alternative requirement. And with that, we support adoption.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Mr. Bothwell?
Good morning, Chairman, members. My name is Sean Bothwell. I'm the staff attorney for the California Coastkeeper Alliance, and I'm representing the 12 waterkeepers statewide. I just want to thank the board for allowing me to speak here today on behalf of the MS4 Phase 2 permit. And I really want to just thank staff. They did a very good job of being open and accessible to our questions, concerns, and I think you can see from the presentation today that they really did their best to try to integrate all of our concerns and really address them within this permit. Overall, the permit takes really progressive steps forward in implementing low-impact development as a stormwater control strategy. We're very appreciative that the final draft permit revised the regional board's executive officers' kind of expanded authority. I realized that the State Water Board had to kind of walk a fine line between, allowing for the special cases that may occur at the Central Coast and providing, public participation and a full and open process. And so we really appreciate the line that they took there. And while we're disappointed with the deletion of attachment J, we are appreciative that they recognize that hydro modification requirements, baseline hydro modification requirements, are necessary and that they were put into this permit. With that said, I want to touch on two kind of large issues, concerns that we still have. I just want to reiterate those. And then I have two small comments about concerns that we may be able to fix here today. First, the permits monitoring program is still inadequate to demonstrate individual permit compliance. I think when you look at the Ninth Circuit opinion with the LA permit, you see that they struggled with this idea of determining individual permit compliance, and one appropriate tool that they determined was end of pipe monitoring, which is not found in this permit, and really this permit's monitoring scheme does not allow for individual permit compliance. You can't determine that based on the monitoring. So we find that still to be illegal, and hopefully we can work towards revising that in the future. The second large issue is TMDLs. I just want to restate that the Clean Water Act requires NPDES permits to include all effluent limitations that incorporate waste load allocations from a TMDL. The Clean Water Act doesn't allow for extensions of time for regional boards to develop these waste load allocations. For the two small issues that I hope we can address today, the first one involves the trash reduction program in section E11F, small Roman numeral 2. We made these comments in previous letters and at the workshop that the section identifies 5 criteria in order for the catch basin to be deemed high priority. And unfortunately, the way it was written, it looked like it required all 5 to be met before it could be considered high priority. And in response to comments from staff, they seem to agree and say that that wasn't their intent, to require all 5 criteria to be met. But unfortunately, the language that's still there looks like you still need all 5 to be met. The word "and" is still being used. We recommended in our comments that to insert the word "any of the 5 criteria to be met" would then deem it to be high priority. So we would ask that that be reevaluated here today. Finally, section B4 on page 19. This deals with incidental runoff. And if you look at the last sentence in that section, it's really overarching. It pretty much encompasses everything I would consider to be incidental runoff. And I think what happened here was this section came from the recycled water permit, which specifically dealt with recycled water. But it was requested that the specific reference to recycled water be deleted from this section in the permit. And because of that, it really makes the entire section unenforceable. I can't really imagine any situation of incidental runoff that would not be exempted from that section. So I would ask that that be looked at, and specifically that last sentence be redacted from that section. And with that, I just want to thank the board and thank staff for all their hard work. This has been a long process, and I really appreciate everyone's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks. Stay around for a second, Sean, while we ask questions, if you don't mind.
And I actually wanted to ask staff to respond to the last 2 suggestions.
So I think one of which was the criteria for catch basin maintenance. So we, as Sean mentioned, the intent was not for you have to meet all 5 criteria. So if it helps to specify any of the criteria, we're open to that change. And then the second part of that with incidental runoff.
Do you have a specific language being recommended, Sean?
I apologize for not bringing you a slide. Let me find the page.
I can propose it
Okay.
if that's helpful. I
Yeah.
think we could just say after meeting any of the following
Yeah,
criteria and change the "and" at the end of 4 to "or."
Okay.
That's correct. That's what we recommended in our comments.
I hope someone's keeping track of these. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
And then the incidental runoff language was pulled from the recycled water policy. So it's verbatim what's required there, and I don't know if it would help to reference the water policy or.
Well, the one thing that's not verbatim is the specific mention of recycled water, and this was in a couple drafts ago, and it's been in our comments, but it was removed from the specific reference to recycled water to just incidental runoff.
Yes, and that was done purposely. The idea was that that if you're irrigating with recycled water or with potable water, you still should be taking these same practices to reduce, to define what incidental runoff is.
But when you define incidental runoff as the unintended minimal overspray with sprinklers that escapes from an intended use area, so that there you define what incidental runoff is. But the next sentence, if it is due to excessive application, due to intentional overflow application, or due to negligence, I just feel like that completely encompasses what incidental runoff is. At least that's my opinion.
Well, I'm just not following what what the intent of this section was, is to say the Clean Water Act allows for incidental runoff from irrigation as a non-stormwater discharge to MS4s. This is designed to limit what is incidental runoff to those things that are leaks that are less than 72 hours, you know, so on and so forth. So it provides a caveat onto what is incidental runoff.
Okay. I think that was just something I needed a clarification on. Is that it?
Wendy Atkins.
Thank you, Chair Hoppen and members of the board. My name is Wendy Atkins, and I'm the Stormwater Coordinator and the Associate Planner for the City of Sonoma. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my comments today. I also appreciate the efforts of the board and the staff in working with the stakeholders of this process. I have a few minor revisions to help me actually implement the permit in the field so we can have an effective stormwater permit, because I'm the person, the staff person, that's going to be working in the office and in the field to implement the permit. I understand that the staff will be preparing a guidance document, which is going to take the form of a template for permittees to use when submitting the notice of intent. And that will be a really great help. But we need this template soon. I'll need to have the document ready for commission and council review by the middle of May in order to submit the notice of intent by July 1st. So the clock is ticking, and that doesn't leave much time. With regards to section E10B 11A, which talks about prior to issuing a grading or building permit, the permittee shall require each operator of a construction activity within its jurisdiction to prepare and submit an erosion and sediment control plan for the permittee's review and written approval. If the erosion control plan is revised, the permittee shall review and approve those revisions. I'm requesting that the board make some changes and have it be similar to the general construction permit SWRCB, where revisions are made in the made to the plan and kept in the field, because this could be a potential delay to contractors if they have to resubmit the plan to me to review every time they make a BMP change. With regard to section E12...
Stop. Go back and explain that one to me again, please.
Okay, so the way I understand the permit...
Hold on, go back. Section E10B...
11A.
11?
It's two little eyes, A.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Okay.
two little eyes, A.
Okay.
So as I understand it, staff will be required to review a contractor's erosion control plan. And if any changes are made in the field by the contractor, they'll have to resubmit that erosion control plan to staff to review. And I propose that they just make that change if they're proposing a different BMP to their erosion plan that's in the field. So it doesn't have to go back through staff for written approval.
Would you notify staff?
It's my understanding for the construction general permit that they don't have to notify anyone. They just have to make changes to their plan that's in the field.
Emil, somebody? Comments on that?
I actually was in Wendy's position back in El Dorado County, where we actually did review erosion sediment control plans to make sure that they met the requirements of the ordinance. One of the things we had up there was a specific seeding requirement for temporary seeding. You know, you're basically stabilizing soil with a specific seed mix. We're looking for things like that. So basically, you know, an ordinance is going to have specific recommendations for, say, sediment basin sizing or seed mix. Those are the types of things we're looking for. We're not really looking for, I think what Wendy's talking about, the real-time adjustments, BMP changes. It's really, you know, does that erosion control plan that's submitted for permittee review, does it have the basic elements that are required in that ordinance? So that's what we're looking for.
Is that clarification enough for you?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. with regard to section E12BII. This section talks about, state that project proponents for projects that create and or replace between 2,500 square feet and 5,000 square feet of impervious area shall use the State Water Board SMARTS post-construction calculator or equivalent to quantify the runoff reduction resulting from the implementation of site design measures. And I went on the State Board site and tried to access this calculator, and it's not ready in its current form for the general public to use. So I would request that you please make sure that this calculator is easily accessible and easy to understand prior to use by the general public. With regard to section E12CIIE, the effective date for applicability of low impact development runoff standards to regulated projects. These include discretionary permit projects that have not been deemed complete. And I propose that the effective date be changed from the completion date to the date the discretionary project received approval. We all know that construction projects are not always completed on schedule. And if I tell a developer, hey, you need to have your project completed by July 4th, 2014, or you're going to be subject to additional low impact development projects, and then on June 30th, they don't have one final sign off on their job card from the public works inspector and the project's not deemed complete, then I have to say, I'm sorry, we can't sign off on your project. You have to go and install these low impact development standards that could be really costly to a developer and take up time. So if you perhaps change that to when the project receives its entitlements or discretionary review, then we'll be able to tell the developer, hey, your project is going to be subject to these because, you know, and they'll have more time. So that's my request.
I'm sorry, which section is that again?
E12CIIE.
I don't have E12CIIE.
I think it's the language at the top of page
58.
page 58.
Okay.
Emil, how do we deal with what's being raised here is certainly not what's in, you know, the potential consequences, not what's intended. How do we deal with this without going through a whole bunch of other iterations?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Do you have a specific, can you repeat, I guess, what the specific change would be in this paragraph?
Yeah, change it from completion date to date of discretionary approval.
So is that the effect, is it in this first sentence, the effective date for applicability runoff projects?
Right, yes.
Did you guys take a look?
So, yeah, so I'll offer up our solution we had for the construction permit, where we just said 2012. I think it was September 1st, 2012. That was a 3-year grandfather period, or actually a date where post-construction standards had to be in projects that were subject to the CGP. I'm talking about a different permit. We're taking the same approach here. We're just saying it's the second year of the effective date of the permit, and instead of tying it to, you know, specific approval. I mean, I think we went back and forth on this, but we felt like it was a little more efficient to just have a drop dead date, at which point, after that period, we'd expect to see these projects in the ground. It's up to the municipality to figure out how to get that done, but by just putting a hardwired date in there, we felt that was the most appropriate way to deal with this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but does that reflect the reality of how projects get done on the ground?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think with the construction permit, people have had their challenges, but I think we've made it work. I mean, when the construction permit was adopted back in 2009, it was pretty clear that we would be expecting post-construction controls 3 years after, essentially, and people have gotten it done, you know, and there's been some issues where we've worked with regional boards and had exemptions. I mean, there's a big out in the construction permit that says if the regional board feels like the sort of structural solution is going to provide equivalent water quality benefit, then, you know, that there's been a pass. But for the most part, people have found a way to work these into the project final design. So that's been our experience, but I'd be interested to hear from the stakeholders here. But I think that's, you know, there was two ways to do it. One is to tie it to actually the approval, and that might vary from municipality to municipality. We chose to go with this, you know, a certain second year after the effective date of the permit to have the expectation would be those controls would be in place.
And Wendy, why can't you have that discussion when the permit is issued to the developer?
We
That
can't.
in 2 years, they have to do these things, and
Right, we certainly can have that conversation. Sometimes when you're working in the field with a contractor, they're kind of hard-headed. Oh, it's not, I don't have to worry about that until July 1st, 2014. I'm not going to worry about it. So we'll just, if the board isn't willing to make that change, we'll just have to make it clear and let them do more outreach to make sure that they're clear that if you're not, final.
it seems like it's less work if you make it clear at the outset. You know, maybe it's not less work, actually, but
And if we could be the heavy, we're happy to do that. We did that with the construction permit. We had, you know, Annalisa Kahara back there, just, we basically sent out a letter to dischargers saying that, hey, September 2012 is around the corner, we're expecting these things to be in the ground. So to the extent that we can help, you know, get the message across. But yeah, so contractors hard-headed, that's nothing new.
We
Send them to Eric and he'll beat them up.
Okay, and we accept all the help from the staff, thank you. With regard to, moving on, with regard to section E14, the Program Effectiveness Assessment and Improvement section, I would just like to ask for help from staff to help us comply with this section. I think I'm personally going to need a lot of training on this, so please help. And then finally, with regard to the TMDL section for Sonoma Creek, the TMDL refers to the Napa River, and this needs to be corrected because the Napa River is about 20 miles from Sonoma Creek. So there's just typo there. Napa River needs to be changed to Sonoma Creek because it's the Sonoma Creek TMDL. And with that, I thank you very much for your time and interacting with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And staff, the last change? Okay.
Well,
And-
but going back to the template, I saw a grimace when he said we need it by May.
It's
Will she
contingent
get it
upon
by
you adopting
May?
the permit today. That's where the grimace was. So
Oh, okay. So if okay, that's a gun to our heads. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, it just strikes me that the pain that you suffer in putting the template together pales by comparison to what they have to do with it once you're done with it, so. The burden be on us to go fast, I think.
And I'm sorry, and the SMARTS database?
So this is basically the calculator that we use for the
Calculator, yeah.
post-construction permit. And so we have this is kind of a generic SMARTS reference. The intent is to have that on a, you know, a phase 2 input screen for the annual reports and that sort of thing. So the intent, it's going to be there. I can tell you right now, it's basically the SMARTS calculator we use for the post-construction measures in the CGP, so.
We've got about 45 minutes of comments. If we're lucky, maybe an hour. I'm sure we're going to have more than a few moments of discussion when we get done with the public comment. So unless any of my colleagues have an objection to it, I think we'll go ahead and take lunch, resume at 1 o'clock, give everybody a chance to think about things, and hopefully that's not inconveniencing anyone's schedule. Mr. Lawfer, you had a closed session, but I assume we have taken care of the need for that closed session, unless I'm...
No closed session.
Okay. We will adjourn until 1 o'clock.